I never understand how this can work, this narrative about how much we love democracy, about how much we object to authoritarianism, can possibly work. But the reason we're so concerned about the integrity of democracy and elections in Venezuela is because we're just so benevolent. We just care so much about democracy. We just want to spread freedom all over the world. So we had a foreign policy event, not in the Middle East, but in Latin America over the weekend that I think so vividly illustrates the most virulent strain of American propaganda that engulfs so many people who like to think of themselves as sophisticated analysts of the public scene, who believe that they are able to see in a clear-eyed way what the American role is in the world. And that is the Venezuelan election, which took place over the weekend, and the successor to Hugo Chavez, who, by all accounts, at least all non-propagandistic accounts, was a genuinely popular figure in Venezuela. The third of the country that's well off and wants the Venezuelan nation to be more pro-American and pro-Western, hated Hugo Chavez. But the vast majority of the country, the people who are poor, who were the working class, adored Hugo Chavez, and he was absolutely representative of the Venezuelan people. And his successor is Nicolas Maduro, both of whom they consider themselves socialists/communists. And in a lot of ways, he's clamped down more on basic civil liberties. In Venezuela, has become more authoritarian. But he also is someone who refuses to bow to the orders and decrees of the United States government. It's been a longstanding explicit American policy in the name of the Monroe Doctrine that we don't allow that sort of defiance in what we call our backyard, which is all of Latin America. And so the US government has long wanted Nicolas Maduro gone. And in advance of the election, we were hearing over and over from Western sources, from American sources, that the only way Nicolas Maduro could win the election is if he engaged in serious and radical fraud to manipulate the outcome of the election. And since the election has taken place and Maduro was declared the winner by election officials, whom he appointed and essentially controls, we are hearing as well that not only that there was major fraud in the Venezuelan election, that he was not the rightful winner, but also that the United States government should take steps either to punish the Maduro government in the form of sanctions, which we already have in place, but even harsher sanctions that, as we know, never actually results in the removal of governments, but only results in the suffering, the greater suffering of the people of that country, makes them weaker and therefore more dependent on the government we're supposedly trying to remove. But the position of the United States is not just that we object to voting fraud in Venezuela, but that we should use this opportunity to do something about it. The government of the United States, had previously tried to engineer coups to remove Hugo Chavez when he was the president, and John Bolton was pressuring Donald Trump throughout his entire tenure in the White House to try and engineer a coup against Nicolas Maduro, and it just failed. So the United States government has made repeatedly clear it wants the government of Venezuela to change, and now it's using allegations of election fraud, which very well might be valid. There's some evidence of election fraud. I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but I certainly am not somebody who's here to say that the election was legitimate. But the question is, why does the United States government have such an interest in alleged election fraud in Venezuela? Here from Reuters on July 29th, quote, "The U.S. accuses Venezuela of election manipulation, leaves door open to sanctions." Quote, "The Biden administration said on Monday that electoral manipulation had stripped Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's claim of re-election victory of, quote, any credibility. And Washington left the door open to fresh sanctions on the OPEC nation. The U.S. and a number of other governments cast doubt on the official vote count. Maduro's opposition rival, Edmundo Gonzalez, asserted that he was the true winner. U.S. officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, amplified public demands by President Joe Biden's senior aides that Maduro publish a detailed tabulation of votes, and said a failure to do so would leave the international community unwilling to accept the announced outcome. Now, I should note that there are some countries, some serious countries, that have acknowledged Maduro's victory, have congratulated him. That includes the government of Russia. It includes the government of Mexico and several other more left-wing countries in the region, although Brazil, which is governed by a center-left president, Lula da Silva, and is the largest, most influential country in the region, has not joined the United States in rejecting Maduro's victory, but they also have not accepted it, saying that the government of Venezuela should release all of the election data so that it could be audited. So there are countries in the world who recognize Maduro's victory. There are other ones who are in wait-and-see mode, and then there are others like the United States who insist that Maduro won only by fraud and that the United States government should do something about that. Now, the question is, why? Why is the United States government so bothered by election fraud in Venezuela? Ironically, the real leader of the Venezuelan opposition was not the candidate who actually ran against Maduro. She was banned from running by the Venezuelan government based on all sorts of accusations of corruption and other acts against the state, very similar to what Democrats wanted to do to Donald Trump in the United States, what the current Brazilian government did to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And there are all sorts of questions around why the United States is so eager to make this an issue. And of course, the media, if you ask them, if you ask the Biden administration, they will say it's because the United States government is a democratic country. We venerate democratic values, and our foreign policy is based on trying to bring democracy and freedom to the rest of the world. That's why we went to Iraq. We were told not only because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, but we wanted to liberate the Iraqi people from the grip of tyranny. That's what we're told we're doing currently in Ukraine, is we're trying to defend the Zelensky government, which has suspended all democratic elections indefinitely. We're told that's the reason we're in Ukraine, to protect Ukrainian democracy from the Russian tyrants. That was the reason we were told we were in Syria trying to remove Assad and in Libya trying to remove Gaddafi, which is what we did, because we are a country that just loves democracy so much and believes so much in freedom that we don't just want it for our own country, our sacred democracy and our freedom at home. That's not enough. We want to make sure every other country has that. And when we see a country like Venezuela denying democratic rights based on a fraudulent election, we get enraged by that. We want to do something about that. We want to fix that. We want to bring democracy to Venezuela. That's the claim that the United States government and the media make as to why we care so much about what happened in Venezuela and why we care so much about who governs it, to the point that we're willing to starve and suffocate the people of Venezuela like we've been doing to the people of Cuba for many decades by suffocating their country, preventing any trade, and basically preventing any kind of prosperity at all in those countries, making the people of those countries suffer because we want to bring freedom to them. And so the reason we make them suffer is because we want to bring them freedom. Now, let's look at whether or not this holds up as a viable rationale, that this is what the United States government's role in the world is, that this is what motivates the United States government when acting in the world to bring freedom and democracy, to fight against authoritarianism and tyranny. As I said, Hugo Chavez was, by all accounts, a popular leader in Venezuela. The West hated him. Hated him. The United States hated him, called him a tyrant all the time. But nobody doubted that Hugo Chavez had the support of a majority of the Venezuelan people, and therefore won the elections that made him president. And yet the United States, on several occasions, tried to overthrow Hugo Chavez and replace him as president of Venezuela with somebody that the United States government liked most. One of the times that the United States government tried to do that was in April of 2002, when George Bush was president along with Dick Cheney as vice president. And there was a coup against Hugo Chavez that appeared for about one day to have succeeded and have driven Hugo Chavez, the democratically elected president of Venezuela, out of office. And here's what the New York Times editorial board had to say about the U.S. attempt that they thought was successful to drive out, to overthrow the democratically elected government of Venezuela and replace him with a more pro-Western leader. Quote, the title was of this editorial, Hugo Chavez departs. Quote, with yesterday's resignation of President Hugo Chavez, Venezuelan democracy is no longer threatened by a would-be dictator. Mr. Chavez, a ruinous demagogue, stepped down after the military intervened and handed power to a respected business leader, Pedro Carmona. So by the New York Times' own account, this was a coup that they thought was successful against the democratically elected leader of Venezuela, who was replaced by someone in the opposition in the United States, like a respected businessman. And in the New York Times mind, in the mind of Western discourse on foreign policy, when a government or a leader who's democratically elected but we dislike is overthrown, that means, says the New York Times, that democracy is no longer threatened. Democracy is no longer threatened, said the New York Times, by the person that the Venezuelan people democratically elected. Now that there's a respected businessman who nobody voted for who's going to take over, Venezuelan democracy is not subverted, which is what you would think if we overthrew a democratically elected leader, but it's actually saved. It's now no longer threatened because the democratically elected leader was removed. So it doesn't seem like we actually take very seriously the idea that countries should be able to be governed by the actual leader who is elected. Remember, for a long time, the United States policy under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration was that the legitimate president of Venezuela was somebody named Juan Guaido, who never ran for president, was never elected by anybody. And yet we just called him, and he called himself, the president of Venezuela. And he used to go around the West. He went to the US Congress, and Nancy Pelosi stood up and applauded and said, "Welcome, Mr. President." We just decided that the Venezuelan president was somebody who was never elected, Juan Guaido, because we knew that he would do America's bidding. In case any of you think that the United States government is actually interested in democracy in Venezuela. Back in 2013, when the Arab Spring happened, as it was so called, and the Western media pretended to be so in favor of the Arab Spring, we were particularly enamored of how the Egyptian people had risen up against this brutal dictator, Hosni Mubarak, and demanded democracy. We were so moved by them. They were so inspiring, these students, demanding elections. Even though the United States government for 30 years was the one who armed and funded that Egyptian dictator, kept him in office, was allies with him. He did our bidding in that region, and we loved Hosni Mubarak. Suddenly that was all forgotten. We were somehow on the side of the students who wanted democracy. And they got democracy. The first ever election in Egypt was held where the people of Egypt got to decide their leaders instead of having dictators imposed on them supported by the West. And the problem was that they elected the wrong person. They elected somebody that the West strongly disliked. Mohammed Morsi, who was Muslim, was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and we saw him as a danger. And we didn't care at all that he was the leader that was democratically elected by Egypt, because we don't care in the slightest whether a country is democratic or not. Democratic countries mean countries that do our bidding, regardless of whether the leader is chosen democratically or imposed dictatorially. And so what happened was that elected leader, Mohammed Morsi, lasted about 10 months in office, the first ever elected leader of Egypt, and he was overthrown by the same factions of the Egyptian army that the United States always supported and aligned with, who kept the dictators in place, and put into power a military junta led by General Sisi, who was anything but a Democrat. And that was under the Obama administration, and at the time, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, described the military junta, the military coup that removed the democratically elected leader. He called it, quote, restoring democracy. The Egyptian army was, quote, restoring democracy. Just like the New York Times said about the attempt to remove Hugo Chavez, the democratically elected president, and impose on Venezuelans somebody they didn't elect. And the New York Times said, oh, democracy is saved in Venezuela. That's what John Kerry said when the democratically elected leader of Egypt, the people chosen by the Egyptian people, was removed, and removed by a military coup that then took over the country and has remained ruling that country ever since with no elections. John Kerry described that as an advancement of democracy in Egypt. You see how not only propagandistic, but this Orwellian that term is when used by the US government and the media. Democratic, advancement of democracy. It always means not that the country gets to choose their own leaders, but that we get to put into place a leader that we prefer. You don't have to go back very long at all to see this in a major, one of the largest countries on the planet, a nuclear armed power, in Pakistan. My former colleague at The Intercept, Ryan Grimm, broke a major story, and I believe he also reported part of this with Murtaza Hussain, that the United States government had played a major role in removing by far the most popular leader in Pakistan, Imran Khan, who had been prime minister, and then helped to ensure that he would be imprisoned. We prevented the most popular leader from remaining in power. We ensured that he would be imprisoned because we no longer liked Imran Khan, and we wanted our Pakistani, long-term standing Pakistani allies in the military to take over the country. Here's what The Intercept reported in August of last year, quote, secret Pakistan cable documents U.S. pressure to remove Imran Khan, quote, all will be forgiven, said a U.S. diplomat, if the no confidence vote against Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan succeeds. So they removed Imran Khan, the actually elected leader of Pakistan. The U.S. government encouraged that. He's now in prison, and we now celebrate Pakistani democracy. There was never, if you recall, any media outcry over the manipulation of the outcome of Pakistan. How come? How come they're so concerned about it when it comes to Venezuela, election fraud in Venezuela, but nobody basically talked about or let alone objected to at least as equal of manipulation in Pakistan, where they actually removed the sitting prime minister who was elected and then imprisoned him? The reason is obvious. It's not because we care about democracy. That's why, if we did, we would be objecting at least as loudly to what happened in Pakistan, a much bigger and more important actor on the international stage than we are talking about Venezuela. But we were happy with the subversion of democracy in Pakistan, just like we were happy with the subversion of democracy in Egypt, and just like the New York Times celebrated the subversion of democracy in Venezuela, because what we care about only is whether the leader does our bidding and is our ally. And then we call it democracy no matter how they obtain power. That's what a democratic country means. And we only object to tyranny when the supposed tyrant, like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, is somebody who is adversarial to the United States government. I never understand how this can work, this narrative about how much we love democracy, about how much we object to authoritarianism, can possibly work given that our closest allies long have been and still are some of the most brutal, anti-democratic, and tyrannical regimes on the planet. Do you ever hear the U.S. media or the U.S. government complaining about the lack of democracy in Saudi Arabia? Are there any movements to democratize Saudi Arabia, one of our most important allies, a country we routinely fund and arm and help in wars, as we did with their war in Yemen, and give intelligence to so they can better spy on their own country? Does anyone ever talk about the need to democratize Saudi Arabia or object to the lack of democracy in Egypt or the United Arab Emirates? No, of course not. Nobody does. Or in Jordan or in Kuwait. Because we have no interest in changing the governments there. We're very happy with the governments there, so we don't care at all about whether there's democracy. Now, just on the question of election fraud, I just want to remind you, and I think this has been whitewashed from history, it's a very important moment to consider. In 2019, the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, who is a left-wing leader, has long been extremely critical of the U.S. government, has long resisted U.S. government attempts to control Bolivia and its resources. The U.S. government hated Evo Morales, and he hated the U.S. He ran for a fourth term, which people in Bolivia thought was unconstitutional, and yet his argument was that it's actually unconstitutional to put term limits on. They have election courts. The election courts ruled in Evo Morales' favor. He was able to run. They okayed the ability of him to run for a fourth term. And what happened was, on election night, in order to win in the first round of Bolivia elections, to avoid a runoff, you have to win by more than 10 points against your nearest competitor. And for most of the night, Evo Morales was ahead, but only by 8.5 or 9%, just short of what was needed to avoid a runoff. And at the very last moment, in the last couple hours in the middle of the night, a huge amount of pro-Morales votes came in to put him over the 10% mark. And the United States government and most of Western Europe united to accuse Bolivia and Evo Morales of having manipulated the election and Evo Morales of not having been the legitimate victor in that election, but instead having committed fraud in the election. Here from the BBC in December of 2019, Evo Morales, overwhelming evidence of election fraud in Bolivia, monitors say. Quote, questions about the legitimacy of the election were first raised when the results count inexplicably paused for 24 hours. The final result gave Mr. Morales slightly more than the lead he needed to win outright, sparking protest across the country. An initial OAS report had already pointed to, quote, clear manipulation of the election and called for it to be annulled. In response, Mr. Morales agreed to replace the electoral authorities and hold a fresh poll. But days later, on November 10th, Mr. Morales stepped down and sought asylum in Mexico following an intervention by the chief of the armed forces calling for his resignation. He denounced the move as a, quote, coup. Do you see, look at how soft that language is because the BBC wanted him gone. What actually happened was Evo Morales won that election and then he was forced out of the country because the head of the police and the military came to him and said, if you don't leave Bolivia and renounce power, we will kill you and kill your family. And he was forced out of Bolivia, a country he had governed for 12 years, also always representing the poorer and indigenous parts of that country, just like Hugo Chavez did. And he was driven into asylum, exile in Mexico. And I was one of the very first reporters to go to Mexico and interview him about what had happened. And that's when he explained how he was driven out of the country. And so the consensus in the West was Evo Morales did not win, that evidence of fraud was overwhelming. And ironically, it was based on the same theory that Donald Trump used to accuse the 2020 election of being fraudulent, namely that all night Trump was in front, and it was only late into the hours of the morning when a bunch of Biden votes came in and put Biden ahead of Trump, which is exactly what the West used to say that Evo Morales committed fraud, namely that he was under the 10% count for most of the night, and then suddenly a bunch of Morales votes came in. Remember, here from ABC News, November 5th, 2020, quote, Trump calls for vote counting to stop as a path to victory narrows. Biden urges all to stay calm. Quote, several key states are expected to release more vote counts Thursday. Stop the count, Trump tweeted bluntly in all capital letters. Shortly after, in a message since flagged by Twitter as potentially misleading, he added, quote, any vote that came in after Election Day will not be counted. That was the same theory that the West used to accuse Evo Morales of engaging in election fraud, even though if you look at every Bolivian election, it's always the case that the last votes that come in are from the more distant rural areas that have always been strongholds of Evo Morales. So he always gets a bunch of Morales votes at the end of the election, but the United States was so eager to drive him out that the West, United States united and denounced that election as fraudulent. Once Morales was gone and a right-wing pro-US government seized power, one also not elected democratically, the West started admitting, including the media outlets that had originally accused the election of being fraudulent, that in fact there was no election, there was no evidence at all of fraud. From the New York Times in June of 2020, 6 months after they drove out Evo Morales with claims of election fraud, quote, a bitter election, accusations of fraud, and now second thoughts. It reminds me so much of how the US media always admits their lies once it's too late. Right before the election in 2020, everyone agreed reporting based on the Hunter Biden laptop was, quote, Russian disinformation. And then once Biden was safely elected in the next year, one media outlet after the next began admitting that all along that reporting was based on fully authentic documents having nothing to do with Russia. And that's what happened here. Quote, a close look at Bolivian election data suggests that an initial analysis by the OAS that raised questions of vote rigging and helped force out a president was flawed. They're saying that the Organization of American States that initially issued the allegations of fraud based on a report and an analysis. That report of that alleged fraud, that report was flawed. Quote, amid suspicions of fraud, protests broke out across the country, and the international community turned to the Organization of American States, which had been invited to observe the elections, for its assessment. The organization's statement, which cited, quote, an inexplicable change that, quote, drastically modifies the fate of the election, heightened doubts about the fairness of the vote, and fueled a chain of events that changed the South American nation's history. The opposition seized on the claim to escalate protests, gather international support, and push Mr. Morales from power with military support weeks later. But now, a study by independent researchers using data obtained by the New York Times from the Bolivian election authorities has found that the OAS's statistical analysis was itself flawed. The conclusion that Mr. Morales' share of the vote jumped inexplicably in the final ballots relied on incorrect data and inappropriate statistical techniques, the researchers found. Quote, we took a hard look at the OAS's statistical evidence and found problems with their methods, said Francisco Rodriguez, an economist who teaches Latin American studies at Tulane. Quote, once we correct these problems, the OAS's results go away, leaving no statistical evidence of fraud. In other words, the West unified claim that Evo Morales won only by virtue of stealing the election and fraudulently manipulating the results, that claim itself, they admitted only once he was out of power and the pro-Western leaders had taken over Bolivia, only then did they admit that those accusations were baseless and wrong. From the Washington Post on the same topic in February of 2020, 2 or 3 months after that election when Morales was forced out, the headline, if we could put it on the screen, Bolivia dismissed its October elections as fraudulent. Our research found no reason to suspect fraud. Bolivians will hold a new election in May without ousted President Evo Morales. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is true of Venezuela, that we're accusing Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro of having won solely by fraud, and we're going to find out in a few months if those claims are inaccurate. I honestly have no idea whether there was election fraud in Venezuela. I've actually seen some evidence that there is that I think is credible, although not dispositive. In countries that generally are more neutral when it comes to these questions, like Brazil, have refused to say that the election is legitimate or fraudulent. Instead, they're urging the Venezuelan government to do what thus far it has refused to do, which is release all of the election data so that it can be audited, which obviously also raises suspicions. My point is not to question claims of fraud in Venezuela. My point is that the United States doesn't care in the slightest about the legitimacy of elections, about whether there's a democratic process that's fair. All they care about is whether the leader who governs and yields power in that country is one that serves the United States agenda or opposes it. If they serve the United States agenda, it's called democratic. If they oppose the United States government agenda, even if they're elected democratically, they're called tyrants and dictators. Now, just to underscore the point, I don't know if we have the Chris Murphy. Yeah, we do. So another obvious example that we've shown you before is in Ukraine, where a presidential election was held in 2010, and the winner was elected to a 5-year term under the Ukrainian constitution, served to 2015. And he was generally regarded as more pro-Moscow than the West wanted, more adversarial to the West. And in 2014, there was a change of government, a forcible coup, and the United States was very open about the fact that it participated in that coup, that it helped it, that it encouraged it. They did it openly. Victoria Nuland, who runs Ukraine, no matter who the president is, went to Ukraine multiple times. She had a bunch of snacks in her purse, which is unsurprising, and she handed them all out to the protesters outside of the presidential palace in Ukraine. And then Chris Murphy, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, John McCain, the Republican senator from Arizona, openly went to Ukraine and pledged to support the supporters who were trying to remove the democratically elected president and install a president the United States wanted. That's exactly what happened. We heard Victoria Nuland get caught on her conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, plotting who should be the next leaders of the Ukrainian government once the democratically elected one was removed with U.S. support. And when Chris Murphy went on C-SPAN in 2014 as a somewhat newly elected senator, he wasn't really well-versed yet in how you lie about these sorts of things, and he was bizarrely candid about what a explicit, overt role the United States government played in helping remove the democratically elected leader of Ukraine and replace him with someone the U.S. government wanted instead.
I will admit to you that I have not been involved in what's happening in Venezuela over the last week, because I've been focused as the chairman of the Europe subcommittee on Ukraine. But with respect to Ukraine, we have not sat on the sidelines. We have been very much involved. Members of the Senate who have been there, members of the State Department who have been on the square. The Obama administration passed sanctions. The Senate was prepared to pass its own set of sanctions. And as I said, I really think that the clear position of the United States has in part been what has helped lead to this change in regime. So I know that there is...
Let me just play that part again, because this is something they usually don't admit. Like I said, I think what happened was the question that he was asked, a very good question by the caller, the only good questions are generally from citizens, not from the journalists, is why isn't the United States doing more to combat the government of Venezuela? Why aren't we doing more to remove the government of Venezuela? Why are you just sitting on the sidelines? And that's why he began to say, well, look, I don't know what we're doing in Venezuela, but I do know that in Ukraine, we're doing a lot to remove the government. And listen to these words.
The Obama administration passed sanctions. The Senate was prepared to pass its own set of sanctions. And as I said, I really think that the clear position of the United States has in part been what has helped lead to this change in regime. So
I really think the policy of the United States has been what has helped lead to the change of regimes, by which he means the removal of the democratically elected president of Ukraine and his replacement, who was not elected, but more pro-U.S. Here's the rest.
I know that there is merit in the claim that the United States sort of has these principles and then we selectively apply them. We get involved in certain places and then we don't get involved in other places. But I think if ultimately this is a peaceful transition to a new government in Ukraine, it'll be the United States on the streets of Ukraine who will be seen as a great friend in helping make that transition happen.
So how is it that you can have U.S. officials openly admitting, boasting, that the reason there's a change in government in a country from a democratically elected leader to one that's imposed on those people undemocratically was because the United States helped engineer the subversion of democracy? How can you hear things like that on the one hand, or know that the United States embraces the most tyrannical despots on the planet in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and then believe, on the other hand, that the reason we're so concerned about the integrity of democracy and elections in Venezuela is because we're just so benevolent. We just care so much about democracy. We just want to spread freedom all over the world. It's something that will never stop being confounding and bewildering to me generally. I understand that propaganda often is designed to work well based on studies of how the human mind functions. It's a science developed over many decades. But sometimes it's so blatant, the falsehoods on which it's based, that I do think it's worth documenting, but it's still something that I don't understand how it isn't just immediately visible as the obvious fraud that it is.